Ang patawaste midakiapi. Wachiapi we imachiapi lena shachanga lakota imataha. Chante washte nape chayus api. Greetings, good day, relatives. I'm Cheryl Crazybull. I'm the president and CEO of the American Indian College Fund. I just shared with you that my Lakota name, Wachiapiwi, it means they depend on her. And I'm a citizen of the Shichango Lakota Oyate, or the Rosebud Sioux tribe, located on the Rosebud Reservation, South Dakota. I'm currently coming to you from what the Lakotas call the Heska, or the White Mountains, the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, where the College Fund is located, and the homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Utes people, as well as many other tribes who this particular area was a place where many tribes came to trade and engage with each other. I welcome you to this second State of Higher Education discussion. I'm happy to host this discussion so that people can become more familiar with Native higher education and with the work of the College Fund. And I hope I'm able to address some of the questions that you have. I invite you to put your questions in the Q&A, and my team who's here will help with answering those. And then I'll take some of the questions myself and also speak with you, maybe being able to answer some of those questions. We did have a webinar a couple of weeks ago where we talked about the general state of Native higher education. And I just want to make a couple of points from that discussion. One being that the College Fund has a focus on supporting Native students and giving Native students that opportunity to access post-secondary education. We mostly work with tribal colleges and universities, and we mostly work with Native students attending those tribal colleges and universities. So, but we also work with Native students who are attending what we call PWIs, or predominantly white institutions, or mainstream institutions. We do a lot of equity work, and that's one of the reasons why our conversation last time and this time, and then the one we'll have again in a few weeks, are just so important for all of us. A couple of the points that I made include that we've seen a really significant decline in Native student participation in higher education. There are, of course, a myriad of reasons for that, but one of the most significant ones is students not having access to the financial resources that they need in order to go to college. We are able at the College Fund to provide about 17.4 million this last year in student aid, and another, let's see, almost $1 million in providing students with other kinds of direct support services. That doesn't even come close to filling the gap. We might get 12,000 applications, and we're able to fund, between 4,000 and 5,000 of them. And that's not fully funded. That's just providing students with some assistance. So even though we know that assistance helps students graduate at higher rates, we also recognize that we need to do a lot of work to help students get the resources that they need. So you can see, they put the link in the chat for the webinar that we hosted last time that really talked about the College Fund and its work, and talked about this crisis in higher education. Today, I'm going to talk about two aspects of this higher education experience. One is the Supreme Court's decision last summer. We're coming up to, a one-year anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision about affirmative action and the impact of that on American Indian Alaska Native student involvement with higher ed. And I'm going to also talk about the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid that almost all students who are going to go to college fill that form out. And there have been lots of issues this year with that. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about that. I'm gonna begin though with kind of giving a little picture of our students, because I think that that helps when we talk about issues like affirmative action and like the experience that people are having with the FAFSA and the pathway to college. So the College Fund has, several years ago, we realized that one of the challenges that our students continue to face is that many of them are first generation students. They don't know what a college experience is like. And so they need a lot of support to navigate that college application process, finding out which colleges are aligned with their interests and their career goals, which colleges are accessible to them in terms of geography, which colleges are what we would call like a good fit for a student. So for our students, they're primarily older, and because they're first generation students, they need a lot of support to navigate that environment. A lot of our students have to contribute to their family's financial well-being. And so we also know that it's really important for us to recognize that about our students and give them the kinds of supports that they need for that. A lot of our students are about a third of our students, the student scholars, are single parents, and nearly half of them have a dependent in their care, which could be a child, but could also be another family member, a sibling, or an older relative. So our students, their characteristics make them unique, and it means then the kinds of supports that we have to give for them need to be unique as well. They need to be focused on those students. So and a lot of people don't know a lot about the history. And I just want to say also, we're not doing the hand raise. So if you raise your hand, just because there are so many people joining the webinar, that's difficult for us to manage. So if you'd be so good as to, offer your question or even your comment in the Q&A, that would make it a lot easier for me to respond and be supportive of the things that you want to learn. So I'll talk first about the impact of affirmative action. So like everyone who is involved with higher education, we watched closely to see what the Supreme Court decision would do to the communities that we work with. Many people don't realize that affirmative action kind of emerged as a way to increase the participation of minority-owned businesses with federal contracting. And over time, when I think the proof was there that having that kind of a preferential opportunity meant that more minority-owned businesses could participate and would be given that pathway to, some economic and social mobility and prosperity. Then it moved into other areas as what we would in higher ed call like a proven practice. And so many people, just a reminder also that there are different kinds of higher education institutions. And so the affirmative action decisions that the Supreme Court made, and then some of the laws that were previously passed, like in California, have to do with that, the definitions of institutions as to whether or not they're highly selective in their admissions process. So most people go to institutions that are open enrollment or are not highly selective. And I like to make that distinction because we see then that the way that you remove barriers for students who attend community colleges, tribal colleges, a lot of state institutions, a number of private institutions, that pathway doesn't have as much of an obstacle as it does for highly selective institution. So the Supreme Court's decision was the University of North Carolina and Harvard, where both institutions are more selective. And so they would allocate spaces and give some preference to students coming from certain classes, the most common being race. So when the Supreme Court made that decision that these institutions could not continue with that practice of giving that kind of preference, then it had a ripple effect across higher education, because then it created this environment where all of us became fearful that it meant that resources, programming, academic degrees and departments might all start becoming the target, frankly, of the same kind of reasoning that was used to eliminate the affirmative action pathway. And so a lot of organizations and higher ed institutions, we've been very aware of and engaged with what does it look like to have this kind of a decision, and what kind of impact does it have. The most for Native people, I think there's a lot of factors that contribute to how we think about this. So one of them is, and probably the most important from my perspective as a Native educator, is that we are citizens of sovereign nations. And there's a whole history there for all of us to learn about when it comes to a deep understanding of the relationship between Indian nations and the United States government. But just kind of like at the top level of that is, it is because we were sovereign nations at the time of contact between the United States and our ancestors now, we entered into treaties. And so treaties are entered into between sovereigns. And when that happened, then we acquired a distinctive identity. And that identity is based in being citizens of these sovereign nations. So we are not a race. And I think when we talk about and look at affirmative action as Indigenous peoples, as Native peoples of this country, that's the context in which we look at it. So then we look at the implications of it from that context. We look at, well, what does it mean then for institutions to, for example, have a Native Studies program, or have a Native Student Center, or have a scholarship program that is directed at Native students? It means that there is what I call a restorative and reparative relationship, where Native people gave up resources, land, gave up their claims to different territories through these treaty relationships, resulting then in obligations on the part of governments. So that's kind of a high overview of what's a really complex issue, but I wanted to put that in there because it's a very important way for us to be advocates for our people. But we are oftentimes, categorized as a race. And so what does that do? It causes people to be fearful that they're going to be unwelcome, and that they're going to have resources that are badly needed for us to attain our higher education dreams, that those might get taken away from us because of this sort of underlying kind of decision, that's underlying environment that says basically that we should be excluded and we should be afraid. I think that that's really one of the things that we just see across the country, that this environment of fear. And so then I'm going to say that I think there's an overreaction to the affirmative action decision. And it has had implications then beyond issues around admissions to issues around educational access, whether or not you can have scholarship programs and, excuse me, and other kinds of cultural resources and things like that that are directed at Native students. So that causes some concern for people like myself and our families, for our students. Are Native scholarships, Native directed scholarships going to be eliminated? Or are they going to come under fire and then there'll be less financial support when we know that's one of the #1 barriers to students going to college? Are we going to see an elimination of funding for things like Native clubs or Native centers? Are we going to see programs that are aimed at helping Native students overcome their social barriers to their educational experience? Are we going to see those kinds of things eliminated? And, so the bigger implication of that is that all of the diversity of our knowledge and our experiences get eliminated from campus. And so we really, we really have to be on top of this. We really have to look at it as people who support Native students' access to education, because we know how valuable it is. As people who support that, we need to be really diligent and observant and responsive in the ways that we try to address this. I often think about the experiences of, being a person who, the #1 reason that you want to go to college is because you want to give back to your community. And you can't get to college because the environment that you want to, like the college that you want to go to, can't integrate you into the college or can't provide you with the financial resources that you need in order to have a successful college experience. So I think affirmative action has been really, challenging for us. And I think that and we're all still watching. And from the College Fund's perspective, as most of you know, the College Fund is entirely supported by the generosity of individuals, of foundations, especially family foundations, our corporate partners, all of those kinds of people recognize the value and the importance of education, and they align with the College Fund's work in that space. And we are all aligned together to address the, I guess, public's concerns about whether or not providing these kinds of resources is somehow a negative experience. I think I've often shared, that Indigenous peoples gave up a lot for the United States to be established, and that in giving up so much, we need the support of allies and each other in order to have a more restorative experience. So I think that is kind of one of the challenges about the whole affirmative action environment. We know that people, of course, are also really interested in making sure that everybody has that equitable access opportunity. So I want to acknowledge, that this has a real impact on minority people's comfort level with going to college. So it's really a critical issue, and one that I hope that we're able to all join together. And I'll talk a little bit more about that after I talk about the what's happening with financial aid, because it feels like, frankly, that these two things of affirmative action happening and then this really well-intentioned revision of the at the FAFSA, which is kind of like, why do they call it that? It's such a hard thing to get out of your mouth, but that those things just sort of like, you know how sometimes things align in the universe and it's not always the best. That's what happened. So what happened was, quite rightly so, the federal government made the decision, the Department of Education, really because of the advocacy of educators and students themselves and their families, that the free application for federal student aid needed to be revised. The application had like over 100 questions. It's really complicated for people to address. It had a lot of questions and that, you know, particularly people from lower incomes or not having any family experience with the FAFSA just couldn't navigate that. So rightly so, as I shared, the Department of Education decided that it was time to revise that. And they did. They cut it from like 100, I want to estimate like 115, 120 questions down to less than 40. And they issued the new FAFSA. It's supposed to be last fall, but it didn't happen until earlier this year. And as is not surprising, I think, with systems, it was completely glitched. The system did not work for students. There were a lot of problems with the technology itself. There were issues with the way the system calculated financial need, and it threw the whole college application admissions process into chaos. So for a lot of us in education, including, you know, institutions, including students and their families, we actually have no way of knowing just how significantly this glitch in the system is going to impact student enrollment. So one of the indicators of enrollment at college is that you complete the FAFSA. If you do not complete it, you know, it reduces the likelihood that you're going to try to navigate that at a later time and go to college. And about for Native students, you know, like at the tribal colleges, over 80% of those students are eligible for federal financial aid. And I always say that it's probably more students are eligible for federal financial aid, but they don't go fill out the form because it's too complicated for them to do that, or maybe they can't access tax records, or, you know, can't access information that they need in order to complete the form. So it's probably a much higher number that are actually eligible, but the number who actually submit and receive federal aid is a lot, you know, is around between 80 and 85%. So the inability of students to complete the FAFSA and the inability of their colleges to make financial aid awards has impacted student enrollment. So usually in early May, most students have indicated, made a commitment where they're going to go to college. They've been able to complete their federal financial aid forms. They've been able to work with the colleges that they applied to, but this isn't happening for us this year. So the College Fund, thankfully, already had our Native Pathways program, and I'll just share a little bit about that program. I mentioned earlier, you know, that we several years ago decided that not only were we about helping students during their college journey, we were about helping students start their college journey. And we decided that one of the ways that you do that is you connect with students while they're in high school. We also, I just want to add, connect with students while they're in their high school equivalency programs, because we recognize that for some students, high school isn't the best route to get their education. So they might choose to get a high school equivalency instead. Many people know that to be the GED, but there's also other instruments. So the one of the things that we decided we would do with the help of some of our funders is do more reaching out into high schools. And we recognize that particularly for Native communities, one of the most important things that we could do was connect with their families. If you, as a mother of kids who went on to college, I remember my own college experience being quite intimidating, like not knowing where to go on campus and not really understanding the process, and then expecting my own children to be able to navigate that. Even I, as an educated person, really struggled with that. So I thought, what really helps is when you can talk to people who understand that this is a whole family experience. People who understand that going to college for many students, but especially for Native students, is not just you, but your siblings, your nieces and nephews. If a third of our students have children, it's their children. It's assuring your parents or your auntie, that you can navigate that environment. And so our Pathways program is designed to do that. It's designed to connect with students in their place. So at their high schools, in their communities. It's designed to connect with families so that not only does the student understand what it means to submit a college application, but their family understands what that means. Not only does a student know what their financial aid package looks like, but their family knows, and the family knows where the student's going to stay, who's going to be their advisor, all of those kinds of things being really critical to that Native student success. So we have a very robust Pathways program, works with about 60 high schools that are on or near Indian reservations. My team and I believe that we are definitely the largest Native org doing this kind of work. And we're definitely the only one that's doing it on a national scale. So it's very important to us to be able to do that. We want to be able to, help our students navigate that college experience. So I have a couple of other points, but I kind of used to people, asking some questions. So I just want to invite you to do that. I described a little bit about the impact of the affirmative action and our concerns about how an overreaction to the affirmative action ruling could cause, the students to feel unwelcome. It could cause a loss in resources and a loss of opportunity for Native students. And we want to be an organization that, helps prevent that. We want to be a good partner with institutions, and we want to be able to bring resources to students so that they can engage with that. So, in the case of affirmative action, it's really important for us to be responsive to that and to look at what kind of advocacy and equity work can be done in that space. And then in relation to student access to financial aid, I think the College Fund recognizes, and we're deeply concerned that students might need additional scholarship funding. They might need emergency aid. They need to be able to access resources. We know that emergency aid has a positive impact on students staying in school, for all students, but in particular for Native students and other students who might come from low income backgrounds. That need to replace a tire can ruin your ability to pay your rent. The college fund has some really good data about student participation with emergency aid programs that show that if we're able to provide students with emergency support for things like utilities, maybe one time when they can't make rent, or if they need food, they need help with a car repair, they're more likely then to stay in school. And I think being able to provide that's really important to us. Being able to increase the amount of scholarship funding and increase the number of people that we can fund with scholarships is real important, because we're combating this really challenging, environment out there around that readiness. So let me see. I hope we have a couple of questions. What are schools currently doing that help or hinder Native students from enrolling? Yeah, I think that you can help students enroll by investing resources in helping them individually navigate what college looks like. We're really encouraging higher education institutions to increase the sense of belonging that students experience, and the College Fund has an excellent guide that looks at how do you create a sense of belonging and a place for students in predominantly white institutions. So there's good advice in there about creating a place for students to gather with each other, to give each other mentoring and friendship support, to make sure that students see themselves represented in the institution. That's available, and I'll have the team put that in the chat so that you can do the link to our visibility report and that continued equity in that space. And I want to advocate for colleges expanding their outreach. A lot of colleges have a very narrow geographic scope that they reach out to, and because Native students live, so many of them, in rural areas, those are often places where students are not reached. And the same is true actually of Native students who might be in urban areas. There are Indian centers in urban areas like Denver, Minneapolis, places like that, where colleges can make connections with students. And so there's some good practices out there, I think, that are readily available. Yeah, I do not know of demonstrations that are occurring on campuses of Native colleges. I appreciate Hope, if you have something in particular. It's not it's not my belief that Native people have bigoted ideologies. I think we have a lot of complicated responses to issues around land, but I'd love to be able to answer that question if you have some specific demonstrations that you could share with me. Going on, let's see. Some of the discussion may not apply to American Indians because of the government-to-government identification. So we are not engaged in what I would call arguments about advocating and protecting funding. We are engaged in advocacy and helping people understand that Native people are citizens of sovereign nations, and therefore classifying us as a race, which is frequently what happens, is not the path to take. I have to say that I believe that one of the justices commented that the United States is not colorblind. So I do believe that it's really important for us to recognize that by providing programs that give some level of opportunity, that removes barriers that are historical and systemic, it isn't just about Native students being able to access higher education. It's about students who and communities of people who historically have not been able to access education. So I know it's important for us to distinguish ourselves as Native people because of our sovereign nation status, but I also want to be a good ally and advocate that, from my viewpoint, these giving these kinds of opportunities to people corrects a historical harm. And so that's my response to that one. I don't know that institutions with selective admission requirements have better retention programs. I think experience with higher education is an advantage. And oftentimes, if you look at the ways that people are able to, I think, get beneficial access. For example, there are very few college admissions, the admissions testing access programs in tribal communities. So if you have to take the SAT, it's not likely that there's a tutor available. But students from middle class and upper middle class communities might have greater access. So I do think there might be some challenging issues in that space. You kind of have to look at the admissions requirements holistically to see, if you're better able to navigate college because college is more familiar to you and your family has resources that can help you do that. It's a little different experience than if you're somebody who doesn't. So that's a little complicated, but yeah, I mean, I think that looking at things like legacy admissions and the testing and things like that, all very complex, but what I'm interested in is making sure that Native students can go to college wherever they want and that there aren't financial barriers or there aren't knowledge barriers that keep them from that kind of access. So, I don't know that I have magic words. What I tell Native people, including my own family, some of you are aware that I have a very large family, large extended family. I get to talk to students a lot. We love our students. We love our people. And I think we're brilliant. And I think that naming the experience that we have when we go to college helps us navigate it. Yes, you are going to get homesick. Yes, you are going to go to an institution that you might not see yourself represented at that institution. Yes, you're going to be away from your family when your family has cultural and other obligations that you feel like you need to be part of. So I really encourage people that you can sustain yourself by relying on your traditional values and your cultural knowledge. So like among the Lakotas, we highly value, self-respect. We highly value that you manage your own behavior and you use your behavior for the good of your community, and you use it in kind of a communal way. And we also value industriousness. So yes, you have to. I always tell students, you're gonna do your homework, go to class. You'll do okay if you do those kinds of things. So I just really encourage our students to see the opportunities and the possibilities for themselves and recognize that navigating that can be challenging. Been years since I went to college, but I went to 3 colleges before I got my undergraduate degree because navigating that experience was very new to me. And navigating those environments, moving from a small town to different environments was really challenging. So I can really relate to that. I think that's really a challenge. Let's see. Talking about colleges, selective versus not so selective. I don't know if applications have gone down to the highly selective institutions. What I do know is that the majority of Native students go to non-selective institutions. So I think that that would be good, a good piece of data to try to connect with. I don't think we'll know because we don't really know the impact of what happened with the financial aid application process, because unless your family's going to fully pay for your education, you know, nearly all students apply for financial aid. They need it often, maybe for federal aid, maybe for state aid. Some scholarship providers ask you to have it. Some merit scholarships are not based on financial need. Some are. So I think that we will be able to see in the fall. And I think the fall will tell us some of the implications of what happened with the affirmative action and then what happened with the federal financial aid. So I think that's really challenging. I think, do I think online education access is helpful? I do think that we are seeing a rise in online education. There is still a huge digital divide between rural America, which includes, you know, Indian reservations and other kind of more metropolitan areas. So I think that there is a place for online education and being able to help students access online education is critical to expanding the access and growing the access and maybe removing some of the barriers that might be associated with transportation or housing. Because a lot of students, if you have to go away from home, you know, to go to school, you might have housing issues or, you know, not have enough access to transportation, or you might have food insecurities. So online education can be helpful, but we definitely as a country need to remove that digital divide so that online access is open for everyone. And I like to ally us with, you know, our rural communities because that's an issue for them as well. Yeah. I don't know that Native students get less financial aid than non-Native students. They may not access student loan programs as robustly. The tribal college students certainly don't. I'd be interested, whenever you have some kind of article like that, you know, I encourage you to, if you want to send it to me at the info@thecollegefund.org, I'm happy to respond and try to figure out what some of that looks like. We're trying for years to get a Native American recruiter. And are you in, do you mean South Dakota or San Diego? There's from Pamela, if you would let me know, I might be able to answer that based on where you're from. Oh, I talked about the college funds outreach programming that works with high schools. You know, we're encouraging students to stay in high school. And yeah, so Karen, that's so interesting. Oh, let's see. Pamela, that is so interesting. I am from South Dakota myself, as I mentioned earlier, and I would think that all of the institutions in South Dakota should have a recruiter who engages with Native students in both rural and urban areas. I unfortunately do not know of specific, you know, if you look at the University of South Dakota, they have a wonderful Native student support program, doing a variety of outreach activities to tribal communities. So I think there are some models in the area. Let's see. Yeah, there are education news reports reporting on the application process. I think if you look at diverse issues of higher education, the Chronicle of Higher Education, you'll see in some of the education publications. I am on the listserv for the Brookings Institution. They just had either yesterday or the day before a rather lengthy examination of the impact of FAFSA issues on student enrollment. So there are some really good resources out there that can look at that. Yeah. So I'm going to ask my team, did we kind of get all the questions? So let me close with a couple of comments about what the College Fund is looking at next. And I just want to say that for those of you that had joined us, there is an extensive there are extensive resources on the College Fund website. You can access, regardless of whether you're a Native person, there's a lot of resources about career education pathways and college admissions and campus visits. I really encourage people to use those resources to look at our scholarship programs, which include, Native scholarships, but also other kinds of scholarships that students can access. We do some wonderful outreach. We're having our Summer of Success, which is a virtual conference. That is going to be the May 19th through the 21st. I encourage you to go to our website and take a look at that. At that conference, our team does all the things that I've been talking about here, which is help students figure out how to, and their families, figure out how to connect with that pathway to college, how to navigate financial aid, how to take care of yourself, what to expect when you go to college, all those kinds of things. That's really, I think, a really wonderful resource for people. I think that if you also want to do other things that are real supportive, we encourage people to vote. The College Fund has on its website a link to, make every Native voice heard, we call it. And we just encourage people to exercise their right to vote. Regardless of what kind of election it is, whether it's a local election or a national election, we encourage people to look at candidates and think about whether they reflect your values and vote. And I always tell people, you want to influence how in our communities, for example, we have a incredible need for infrastructure and housing. We have an incredible need to meet people's food security needs. And where does the resources come from for that? They come from federal and state budgets. And where do federal and state monies come from? They come from us paying taxes. And so who makes those decisions about where to put money? People that we elect. And so I really encourage people to vote, because the people that we elect and put in office, not only do they influence our social environment in this country, but they are the deciders of where our money goes. So you want more federal financial support through the Pell Grant? Elect people who believe in education and who believe that the public has a role in ensuring access to education through things like the Pell Grant program. We also really encourage you to support this national outreach, advocating for education yourselves. You can access, your own congressional delegation and advocate for them to invest in education. And you can do the kind of investment at all levels. I mean, one of the implications of affirmative action being struck down is that we might see fewer people of color entering the professions like becoming doctors or lawyers, or some of the the programs that really we need those kinds of we need those people in our communities. And we need that opportunity, that pathway for people to be able to get into that. So we really encourage doing that. And then, of course, the last thing that I'll share is the College Fund is always, always committed to finding additional resources for our students. So we really, we do a lot of work to increase the visibility of Native people, to increase the visibility of education as a pathway to community wellness and to family prosperity. So the College Fund, we look to that kind of connection between our vision together and our ability to invest in that vision. So I just encourage all of our listeners to think about that and think about what are the different ways that you can contribute. Ask your alma mater how they are supporting Native students. Be an advocate for Native students to have the resources and the opportunities that remove barriers to them participating with education. I think that that's really a good thing. So I hope we were able to answer your questions. There's a lot of links in the chat. Once this is done, this webinar will be up on our website along with the last one. Next time in June, I'm going to be talking about the impact of having had a significant influx of resources into our tribal college communities and for our tribal students who are in education during COVID, and how that increased enrollment and it increased graduation, and it had all the impact that increased investment demonstrates. And now what? Now what's going to happen, and how are we going to continue to support our tribal communities and our tribal students with their education pathways now that those resources, which proved that you can do more to help students, that got proven through a really tragic time, but it did prove that. And so now what can we do as organizations and as people to ensure that that keeps happening? So I hope you have a great rest of your week. I hope you have a Memorial Day holiday that just brings you close to your family and gives you lots of opportunities to be together. So thank you, and hope to see you next month. Thank you.